Meanwhile, we can go to our next speaker, Ed Lewis, if you'd like to come forward. Ed is my colleague. He's going to talk about DNSSEC cryptographic habits of the gTLD second level zones. And also Ed is the winner of having the longest title for all of these slides. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. When you want longest things, you always want cryptography involved. So this work is a look at data, looking at the names registered or names delegated in the zones where ICANN has some involvement. And I'll have to qualify that a bit, I guess. ICANN has a number of gTLDs that we contract out. There are a few other zones that we have responsibility for or some insight into. And so I've taken those zone files and I go through them and look for DS records. And I start looking at what people who are registered in those zones are doing with DNSSEC. The source for the data that I'm going to present today is from May 1st. Looked across all of the zones that day, and I did a query across the internet for all the key sets I could find and look things up. I did something similar 2 years ago, coincidentally 2 years ago, almost to the day, which I presented at the center meeting in June of 2015. And so I have that data up here too, where it's available, just for comparison's sake. And I also make a note about this. In my numbers here, I use millions, thousands, and ones in places because I just kind of want to fuzz out the lower digits. I don't think they're that significant. They kind of take away from the point. Plus, there's some uncertainty in the collection of the data that comes across the internet. So what do I look like? What do I look at? I'm looking at currently across. If you go to the root zone, there are 1,530 delegations right now. From that, 1,387 of them are signed, and I think it's signed some way, and 1,339 actually have DS records. There's a smaller number there. Not everybody who signs a TLD puts a DS record into the root zone right away. In fact, some have waited years to do that. Now, the zones that I'm studying are down below that. The asterisk is kind of funny because zones are coming and going at all the time, so that to make numbers add up, I have to account for things. But roughly, I'm looking at about 90% or 80% of all the zones that are currently delegated that I have access to. About 90% of the DNSSEC ones are under ICANN in some way. And below that, 1,213 now of the class of 2012 are signed. They're signed by requirement from the start, and there are a few before that. One thing I wanted to highlight that really doesn't come out in this chart right now, that in the ICANN world, there's only one gTLD that does not have DNSSEC with a DS record in the root zone. So we have almost every one of our zones that the community has leverage over has a DS record. There's one other zone that we operate that also is not signed. It's kind of still needs to be debated. It still needs to be determined where we can go forward with that. And most of the places nowadays where the DNSSEC hasn't been rolled out have come into other areas of the root zone. So, but we only have there's really only one gTLD left out of over 1,200 that have to get DNSSEC fully deployed through the root zone. But I'm not here to talk about the root zone. But I thought that was interesting. Looking at the SLDs, looking at the second level, the next level down in these TLDs. Oh, one thing I should add too is in the ICANN world, the top level domains only have one level. So the second level is who is registered in that zone, something.example, for example. In other parts of the DNS, like the CCTDL area, they use a deeper structure. So I don't have to deal with that in this study because it's all the ICANN structure. So. Total names, 186 million were what I came across on May 1st. And this is not all the TLDs out there, but just the ones I have access to. Nearly 1 million of them are assigned, have a DS record, meaning that roughly 0.5% of what I come across is signed. Now, before anyone runs off with that number, thinking that's saying DNSSEC is only that level, I have a question for, there are a lot of CCTLD operators in here in the room. This is totally informal. How many CCTLD operators right in the room here have over 0.5% over 600,000 signed delegations. One. Okay, just one. Okay, so the point I want to make was I have lots of data. I cover lots of the root zone, but I don't have the biggest DNSSEC zones in my measurements. So keep that in mind when you look at these percentages. There may only be, I may have 90% of all the signed zones, but I don't have 90% of all the delegations. They're in other areas. So this kind of gets nerdy really fast about the protocol, so forgive me if you get lost in numbers and such. But if I look at the DS records that are reported to us, there are about 1 million DS records that I'm looking through. Almost 1 million, 993,000 different names are in there. A name can have more than one DS record. So that's why this doesn't add up right. One of the issues we've had in protocols across the board is forward compatibility, backwards compatibility, and so on. And in the DS record, there's this particular thing called a hash, a DS record hash. And originally we had one DS hash. It was the SHA-1 DS hash. Later on, folks decided that that wasn't going to be very good to have, so we defined a SHA-256 hash. And in the document defining that, the RFC that defined that said that you should maintain backwards compatibility by having the old DS hash present in addition to it until such time as it wasn't needed. So one of the things I've measured over time was this. Right now we have 275,000 names that have the old hash, the old style hash. 227,000 of those only have that old hash. They haven't put the new one in there. There's 765,000, about 3 times as many, have the new hash, which is good, and those are generally those that came in after the root zone was signed in 2010. I mean, the new hash is over 10 years old. And there are 717,000 of those which only have that one. So that the point here is that if you're a recursive server operator out there and you choose to have one of the 2 hashes in your system, not both, you're not going to see some of these names. You're going to miss either the smaller third or the bigger 3/4 of this. That means that recursive server operators will always have both of them out there, and therefore we probably won't see much movement in that, removing the old hashes out there. Now, there are 2 other hashes out there. There's a GOST hash, and there's a SHA-23884 hash that have been defined, and they're experimental. They're listed as experimental, not standards work. And there are people playing with that. It's encouraging to see a number above 0 means I actually measure it and see it. Of that, though, what I call flying solo, there are 20 names that only have the GOST DS hash there. So most those folks, I'm sure they know what's going on. They show that not everyone's going to actually be able to use that hash, and therefore not doing DNSSEC, or they're probably experimenting. And down below I have some more stats. 48,000 names have the old and new together, which is kind of what we expect to see a lot of. We only see 48,000 of those. And then there are 81 that only have the experimental ones in there. If you look at the numbers, I have 20 only with GOST, 60 only with SHA-384. There's probably someone who has both of those 2 and not the other ones. That's probably where the 81 comes from. I like to make sure all the numbers add up, so I look at this way too much. So the next part of a DS record, the DS record, first of all, it's a hash of the key, so that hash is important to the DS record. But also I can look at the DS record and look at what key does it indicate there. So RSA SHA-1, there's 712,000 DS records pointing to one of those keys. The reason why this becomes interesting is the recent backlash against RSA SHA-1 in general, thinking it's too weak, it's not sufficient for security. But currently in the DNS, it's very prevalent, and it'll keep coming up in the talk. SHA-256 is 189,000, and then there's EC SHA-256T, which is a elliptic curve. It's there, and then there's a few other ones out there. At the bottom, I list other algorithms I've seen. The first one, the delete one, takes some explanation. This is evidence of someone experimenting with an automated way to get the child and the parent to coordinate on DS records and key records out there. There's one example of that out there that someone's playing with it, and then so on. Private DNS, private OID are evidence of folks who are exercising their right to do whatever they want without telling anyone else what they're doing. Those are types of records, those are types of keys that were defined. You could do whatever you want in those key records. And there are some people making use of that, and so on through there. There's some other algorithms out there which have been defined but don't have much use right now. Looking at the flags here tell me whether the keys have a couple of types. There's a key signing key, which is what Matt talked about earlier that we're changing. It signs the other keys in the zone. The ZSK, the zone signing key, signs all the data in there. And it's a split created to make keys a bit more manageable. The name, there's almost everybody has a KSK and ZSK. Some have one or the other. I didn't dive too deeply into this at this point, but that's pretty much what we expect. Now below that, we have this thing called revoked keys, and the revoked KSK would pretty much only be used in an operational sense if you're doing the automated updates rollover, 5011. And outside the root zone, there are probably few places where it's really necessary to do this, but there's some evidence out there. Some people probably have experimented with it. What I would have liked to do is see how long they've been there. They may be forgotten for all I know. And revoking a ZSK to me, I can't think of a rational reason why I would ever do that, but there's less than 10 of them out of a million, so it's not widespread. So this chart is one that got some attention 2 years ago, and I'm repeating it now, and it has one interesting change to it. Again, RSA SHA-1 is dominant. It's by far the most used key out there in the DNSSEC area. 256 is also popular out there, not nearly as popular. And that asterisk there means that when I looked at the data, I think I overcounted back then, so it hasn't shrunk. It's probably growing up there. It's probably been going up. The next one, the elliptic curve one there goes from 38 that were seen 2 years ago to 147,000 now. That's a reflection of folks innovating and using newer technology and throughout the internet, and they've been able to bring it on there, and it's actually a growing area. The elliptic curve is thought to be a better way of doing this for different reasons I won't get into, but it's where people are experimenting now. And then down below I have the other protocols that are seen, and you can tell just by the relative size of the numbers whether or not they're popular or not. Now the other factor we look at is, besides the algorithm, but also the size of the key. And this is not a complete list. I only put some of the sizes up here. And generally I have 1,024 bits and 2,048 bits on the screen. What I should add is that there are a lot of places where the keys are off by one error. There are a lot of keys that are like 1,023, 1,022, 1,025, all these odd numbers, which from anecdotal to evidence, that comes from software errors in generating keys out there. There's some products that didn't do the right thing. The nice thing about the protocol, though, the protocol doesn't care how long the key is. It doesn't have to be exactly these precise numbers. But statistically speaking, those numbers are like 1 or 2 here and there, so I didn't present any of that. So what this says here is I saw 2.2 million keys when I collected. And again, that's just for the keys that I have access to. 1.3 million of them are still RSA SHA-1 at 1K, 1,024 bits, the one that we want to move off. Many people want us to move off of. Elliptic curve is now the number 2 most common, and elliptic curve keys are always the same length, so there's no qualifier there. 335,000 of them. That's quite a bit jump because they were only 80 of them seen 2 years ago. That's by far the largest movement. The rest of them haven't really moved a lot. RSA SHA-1 2048 is 217,000 and so on down the line. I won't bore you with all the numbers here, but you can obviously see just from the size. To me, the size of the number matters more than the actual value in this case, given the uncertainty in some of the experiments. But it shows that in the DNSSEC world, operators pretty much are sticking to what they're taught to do. RSA SHA-1 1024 for the longest time with the examples in all of our workshops, documentation, software defaults, and that's what goes into the place out there. And for those who are looking to make sure that we're agile in the area, need to look at all the dynamics and getting us to have stronger keys if that's the concern you have. And with that, I believe that was my last slide of numbers. Yes. And I'll open the floor up for questions. And in this case here, I didn't put as much of a story around this. These are just numbers of things that I found looking a while ago. So ask away. Richard?
Hey, how you doing? Rick Lamb, I can. While you're doing this stuff, great work, by the way. Did you, how many second level domains did you see were doing a algorithm roll? Did you see any?
I haven't been able to check that. The reason why I haven't checked that is I would need to have a series of data to see whether there's movement. And one thing I'd like to do with this is collect these more regularly and see that kind of effect. I do that for TLDs, but not for SLDs.
I've got a question, and this just occurred to me, so I'm shooting from the hip here. Roy Adams, by the way, for the recording. Does it make sense to look for the RSA keys, to look at the distribution of exponent sizes as well? So like 3 or 1 of the size.
It's a good idea. I have that information. I didn't bother. I didn't. I never. I have the information because it's actually something I pulled out of the key record. I just never really thought to present that because I think that there was a concern about that a couple of years ago about whether certain exponents were causing buffer overflows. And so I actually have that map marked out there. I just didn't bring it out. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. If we have no more questions, then I would like to thank Ed for the presentation.